Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of An Evening with the PM. I'm delighted today to be joined by my friend Steve Gaskin, who's one of the UK's leading crime experts. He's an ex-police detective, and Steve now consults in crime for both TV and radio, and he's also a criminal psychologist. And I've had a lot of burning issues on my mind to talk about in relation to the police and crime and things that are happening in the UK. So I thought Steve would be the perfect person to come on and give us his insight into a lot of this stuff. So Steve, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, good to be here. Hope I can bring some enlightenment, as they say.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just say for the audience perspective, there's a little bit of a time lag because Steve's not in the same part of the UK as I am, so hopefully this should work fine. We there might be a slight delay in our hearing each other, but so I'll try and kick off and see if we can have a good discussion then. So I think one of the things I wanted to start with was it seems to me that there's a lot of justifiable frustration in the way that countries like the UK is being policed at the moment. Partly perhaps from Home Office directives, partly from how the police is being run, functioned, and possibly even funded in terms of, the a lot of things that I think in UK society that people might like to see dealt with more seriously seem to have been in a sort of de facto sense either decriminalized or it takes a lot of offences for someone to actually end up going to prison. So I'd love to get your take on a sort of the general sort of how you think the policing is going and how it's been going and what might have changed for the better and for the worse for you in the last few years.
Yeah, so it's a great open question. That I mean, if we go right the way back to Georgian times to 1839, that's when the Metropolitan Police Act came in, and the police were formed, and they were actually hated, would you believe, at that time, because it was something quite new, and hitherto it had been sort of lords and wardens of London that took that over. So you then steadily moved through, and after about 10 years, the CID was formed to try and look at more serious offences, and most of this was marshalled by the then Home Secretary Robert Peel.
Mm.
So things basically for me, the important thing is I joined in way back in 1976, and the big integral difference between now and then is the politicisation of the police service. In other words, when I joined, the chief constable had operational freedom to do what they wanted, and no one could interfere with the operational decision of a chief constable. And that was actually tested in law through the Crown versus the Chief Constable of Northumbria. But that is different now because about 15 years ago, and I was nearly party to this, the Conservative government brought forth police and crime commissioners. And that is a political appointment. In most cases, I mean, you do get one or two people that are independent, but largely it's a political appointment. And their job is to set the policing agenda for the local populace, which is a good thing. Is a good thing in my view. You know, each different police force, and there are 43 of them in England and Wales, are different. They're different in size, they're different in makeup, ethnicity, and everything else. So that was a good thing. The bad thing is that it then brought party politics into policing. And I think that has strongly influenced the type of chief constable now that is appointed. The further difficulty in the Metropolitan Police Service under the current Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, is he's caught in this so-called matrix management. So on one hand, it's the Home Secretary who hires and fires. It's actually the appointment is actually by the sovereign, yet he is accountable to Mayor Sadiq Khan. So you've got a lot of things going on there, and the policing board in London is comprised of people that in the past, from the history, and this is not my expression, are largely anti-police. So if you take Mayor Sadiq Khan, for instance, his job was suing the police through his solicitor's firm. So maybe that's, I don't know, maybe that's a good thing to have him in post. But that is, and that so that's one problem is the politicization of the police service. So not
Mm.
working to an operational agenda, which is in this country we have policing by consent, which I'm very proud of. We're largely an unarmed police service, but now party politics have crept into operational policing, and hence, and maybe we'll talk about this later, is this so-called two-tier system.
Mm.
So that is one big problem. The other big problem, in my view, with the police service at the moment, there's probably three. One's politics. The second one is accountability. Who are the police accountable to? I remember on a scholarship for university in the Met, I had to write an essay. Who are the police accountable to? So, accountable to their own conscience. But the most important thing, and this is where I think the police have lost a huge amount of ground, and there's reasons for that, is one of losing sight. It's like any business, it's losing sight of what your customers want. So a number of
Mm.
years ago, I did some work with Sainsbury's, and they were actually losing huge volumes of customers. So what did they do? They made it customer focused. And if you go to Sainsbury's now and say, "Where's the sugar?" someone will actually escort you. And that was part of their. And of course, they came through that and then bought Argos. And so it's the same with the police. Really, is losing sight of who is their customer. So the current Home Secretary, very laudably, has said two things: is she wants to bring back, and sort of policing does tend to be quite cyclic. She has said that she wants to bring back home beat officers, which is, for me, the most important thing is the police constable on the beat. And that's not changed since 1839. Why? Because most people, from surveys that I've run and I've seen, all they want to do is to be safe. They want the
Yeah.
police to investigate crime, but the things they really don't like is graffiti and rubbish. So if you poll areas, but the trouble is that so the three problems is first of all politics, accountability, and the third part is recruitment and retention. So a number of years ago, and again, the College of Policing, which are the overarching academic body, if you like, or the public body to overarch all 43 police forces, and they sort of set the operational policing tone. And the members are chief constables, deputy chief constables, and in an attempt to professionalise the police service, again, very laudably, they've made, in my view, a huge mistake, and that is insisting that by the time a constable finishes their probationary period, that they have a degree in policing and police studies. Now, I'm a product not of that system. And I'm very grateful for this. I was hugely educated by the Met, and I'm very grateful for that. Sent off
Mm.
to university and everything. But the trouble is, you see, the backbone of the police service is not people with degrees. And what they should have done is rather than that type of professionalisation, is to come up with a body very similar to, say, maybe the Law Society,
Mm.
where all officers are members and they have to do professional exams. But the degree time is taking up so much time. And of course, the confidence in the police service at the moment is not particularly good. And that's probably an understatement. So it's
Yeah.
difficult to recruit. You've then got this cycle of where people joined 30 years ago and they've left. And the commissioner, for instance, in London said, hold on a minute, retire, I'll give you your pension, carry on doing your job. But he has found, so that was called retirement or pension plus. He's found that that's very, very expensive. So there's a big brain drain, if you like, as well, of senior police officers or all police officers going out the door. And because the confidence of the moment and the pay in the police service has not kept up with the rate of inflation, it's difficult to recruit people. And if you award them a degree, they can then take that degree. And when I joined, I sort of took the Queen's shilling, if you like, for 30 years. But no longer is that the amount of time that most officers serve. The average is about 5 years.
Wow.
So when you look at all three of those things cumulatively and put together, that is affecting the operational ability of the police service. And I thought very, very carefully about using the next word, very carefully actually. But Sir Mark Rowley, the commissioner, has come out and said that he's going to do less for less. So the Metropolitan Police Service are in austerity. You can call it whatever you like, but they've had, I think it's 360 million removed from their budget at a time when the Home Office and the Home Secretary are saying recruit more people, bring it up to the correct levels against the backdrop of people leaving. So the police service are in austerity, and some of the bigger metropolitan forces like the Met, Greater Manchester, West Midlands, they've got the resilience because of numbers to be able to do more for less. But in our area where we live, and I noticed the Chief Constable of Norfolk, Suffolk, and another smaller force are going under. You know, if they were businesses, they would almost be sort of in liquidation stakes. And now, again, what I'm trying to do is to give a balanced view. This is not of a cynical sort of ex police officer, but one wonders if you take Devon and Cornwall, for instance, they are paying £180,000 times three for two suspended chief constables, not one, but two, and having to pay the salary 180 grand. So out of their budget, just for their chief constable, you've got £540,000 going out per annum. And they're buckling. They're buckling underneath that. Do you know, and I speak from great experience when I tell you that last year, locally in Norfolk and also at the Metropolitan Police Training School, I had the pleasure of delivering some training. If you like, I was on a contract from Anglia Ruskin University, almost in a sense like a supply teacher. So where there was gaps, but I had the opportunity of delivering some protracted sessions on the law, ethics, and everything. And I've got to tell you, these young people, and they are predominantly young, are so keen. They're so keen. But
Mm.
I found that after a certain period of time, they then come back, and that enthusiasm has been dented because they have so few personnel to be able to deal with all the problems of the public that they feel very, very disheartened. And it's like anything that if you don't like it or it's causing you pain, you've got to get rid of that pain. And the other thing that, of course, is since Wayne Couzens, and I had a lot to do with the psychology of Wayne Couzens, and as you rightly said, I was on Channel 5 talking about Wayne Couzens. You've got a heightened awareness, not so much constables killing people, which was even I'm retired, I hung my head in shame over that particular case. But you've got a heightened awareness of disciplinary offences. So in the Metropolitan Police Service, there are about 250 officers that have got the sword of Damocles hanging over them, in that they're going on
Mm.
disciplinary boards where they could lose their livelihood. Some of it is for very severe offences, um, so but the trouble and the other thing that really really concerns me is this. Now, My IQ is of a certain level. And when that IQ was applied to policing and police work, plus my academic ability, plus my experience, I was able to investigate serious and organized crime. Why? Because I had the resources and I had the expertise under my command to do that. A lot of police forces now are having to reduce the very thing that I think the public want from the police service, and that is into a type of anarchy in a sense. The Met Police are reducing their capability from what it is now by 15% next year because they haven't got the expertise and they've got the commissioner's pie is getting smaller and smaller. So therefore, he has to apply that to where it's most needed. So if I was an organised criminal, that is giving me a bonus. It's making it that bit easier. You've then got the whole chain of the criminal justice service. The next part is the Crown Prosecution Service, who are under enormous pressure. And then you've got, as we know, His Majesty's Prison Service. And I think as of today, their capacity or the occupancy is 87,000. And guess how many people are in prison? 88,000. So we then, as a country, have got to decide: do you want to build another primary school to educate people, or so you've got to apply a subjective test, or are you going to build more prisons? And I never thought I'd hear myself saying this, that as a retired police officer and now an academic, as I believe that we're sending too many people to prison, and there are other crime. So we can't just continue building prisons. That's just simply not going to work. And the other thing, of course, is the recruitment of prison officers. So it's really, and where we've met before, you'll know one or two people that have gone into the prison service, and they really do enjoy it, but they're under enormous pressure. So it's not just the police; it's the whole criminal justice system that is under enormous pressure at the moment, as is other public services. So there is a very long answer to a very short question.
Yeah, I mean it's brilliantly and comprehensively des described, I would say, the four fundamental problems and how they all link into one another. I mean, there's so many places we could go now. I mean, let's go straight to the prisons because you mentioned those last, and the it's let's be honest, for most people, it's not a very attractive proposition to be a prison officer at the moment with all the problems you're having, and like you said with the police, the pay as well, and a society that has to or feels compelled to release a certain number of prisoners early because there just aren't enough prison places is firstly it's a nation that's showing it's in crisis. It's showing it's not handling the situations adequately, but it's also creating the kind of message to people who are criminals and potential criminals that they can in many cases act with relative impunity or certainly have a number of offences before they're likely to feel the force of the law. So in terms of the prison problem then, who do you no, I think I've lost Steve.
Yeah.
Sorry, we just lost Steve for a second there. So I was just asking Steve, in terms of prison and the population of prison, who, given the delicate balance between, you know, punishment and keeping people out of society while they're serving prison sentence, and and the virtue of rehabilitation, who would you say, which groups of people would you say the prisons population and the prison service is not serving well enough? Perhaps people you think shouldn't be in prison that are, and possibly maybe the question in reverse, are there people that are getting away with too much in your view that should be in prison quicker?
Yeah, very, very interesting question. I think really for me, and my job when I arrived in Norfolk was head of education for the Eastern Area Prison Service. And one of the questions I asked myself is, what is the object of imprisoning someone? Well, for me, it's twofold. It's firstly, the abhorrence of society that thinks that someone should have their rights, and effectively that's what it is taken away from them. And secondly, as a punishment. But let's not kid ourselves. If you look at Ofsted, who Ofsted and His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, when they visit prisons, let's not kid ourselves one iota that it's a place of rehabilitation, which I found very, very frustrating. So still, when I tried to set my strategy out for Majesty's Prison Service for learning and skills to try and stop an offender or a recidivist going back into prison, I
Mm.
found that I was trying to build a strategy on shifting sand because the prison service had a policy of incarcerating people and making sure they didn't escape, and that was their primary function. So my one was secondary, and the ability on a mass scale to rehabilitate prisoners is an absolute myth and misnomer. So then you've got to look at, okay, you've got well about 87,000 places. Who should be in there? Well, one of the things that so before I came on here tonight, I looked some things up. So 25% of all people that are in His Majesty's prisons are armed forces. I was shocked by that, ex-armed
Wow,
forces. I was
really?
absolutely shocked by that. So where is the empirical study? Where is the maybe debriefing? And a lot of them are in for violence. So, look at 12,500 people are serving life imprisonment for either serious sexual offence or murder. So you've then got to look at the rest of them really. So the 12,500 serving life, and you've got 77 serving whole life sentences. That means that they will never be released, and that's been around for about 30 years. And the whole idea was to confine that to someone very, very similarly to when we had capital punishment. But that number has escalated up. I think as of today, it's 80 people. So they would never be released. So you can write off those 80 places.
Mm.
The other debate, and you've asked the question, and I'm going to answer it head on. I spent 12 years of my 30 years investigating serious drug trafficking at great expense to my personal life, which I won't go into. But I was working on legislation from 1971, and that was emergency legislation where this country were very concerned and indeed frightened about the influx of Class A drugs, cocaine, heroin into the UK. However, what I saw operationally was it didn't matter how good we were as a squad at looking at drug trafficking at the highest level, even having some gangs sent to prison for life, there was still someone in the wings to take over.
Yeah, yeah.
So, given that there was a huge population of people inside for drugs and all the corruption and all the violence that breeds, we need to have a debate, a political debate, about what we think about a legalization. And my answer to this rhetorical question, is that the whole lot, lock, stock, and barrel, should be legalized, because the idea of a fight against drugs or combating drug trafficking will never, ever happen. So we need to look at that, but then we need to look at other models from other countries. But for me, and in direct answer to your question, we need to incarcerate and try and rehabilitate people that are going to prison for violence and
Mm.
for abusing vulnerable groups. So vulnerable adults, obviously children, and the whole child protection issue. When you look at of the 12,500 people that are in prison for murder, two-thirds of them are in prison for life for domestic abuse.
Mm.
That is an
Yeah.
outrage. And every year the murder figures reflect that year on year out. And what we're missing there is the preventative edge to try and educate, and it is mainly men, around that. So, but I think for violent offences, the two sort of things that I mentioned is an abhorrence of society, and then secondly, punishment
Mm.
because of, violence. So that is, I think, where the focus needs to be. But the rehabilitation for someone that is violent is very, very difficult and it's very costly.
Yeah.
And the other thing superimposed on the whole thing is the mental health of people that is in prison. And again,
Yeah.
that is
Sure.
extremely high. This sounds as I'm painting a very, very bleak picture, but I think when you do that and ask the question, you've got to then turn it around and say, okay, so how do we get around that? Well, first of all, I think that we could, and it would be less expensive. I think it costs, don't quote me on this, I think it's something like 35 to 40,000 pounds a year to keep someone in prison. So that's a lot of cash.
Yeah.
So we should be looking, dare I use the word entrepreneurially, at what alternatives there are. I'm particularly into restorative justice. In other words,
Yeah. Yeah.
someone make it good, because we haven't really tried that. There could easily be a whole raft of work around that just to try it. But the idea of us keep sending people to prison the way we are now is the infrastructure is just not there to keep
Mm.
pace.
Let me ask you a couple of related questions on what you said, because I think we've basically agreed that if that a lot of crime is directly or indirectly related to drugs.
Yes.
And so your your contention of potentially legalizing drugs to at least divorce drug taking from the criminal element, like say, I mean, there was a time, of course, when in 30s America that alcohol was prohibited under prohibition, and there were crime rackets associated with alcohol. Of course, now we don't really have such a thing. So if we if we could see a vast reduction in crime because of drug legalization, which I'm open to, has anybody around the world tried that? I know they've legalized marijuana in quite a few places, but has anybody actually had a radical program to try this and see what effects it has on both criminality and on society in general?
Very, very much so. Mr. Trudeau, I think it was from Canada, legalized cannabis, and that's why there has to be a lot of research. Short term, it worked. So the idea, my sort of utopian idea, I suppose, if that's yeah, is to legalize everything, and that's heroin, cocaine, everything, and put a tax on it, so
Hmm.
that people that are then addicted to drugs can be treated, and the education program in schools, which I can't really comment on, but the last time I saw was woefully inadequate. It was a bit like a satirical sketch. Don't take drugs. Well, that's not good enough. And I think the program needs to start a lot younger. But the answer is no, there's not really um, been any real empirical studies that have been bedded in for a long time to see if it actually works. But there needs to be. some alternative to what we have now. The good side
Mm.
is, and I'm going to be doing a TV program on this, is the sequestration of assets associated with drug trafficking. Proceeds of Crimes Act 2002 is an extremely good vehicle for bringing money into His Majesty's Treasury. So that would be on a much larger scale. So
Mm.
that could work. I mean, the trouble is, I know that both of us are interested in politics. Can you imagine Sakir, a former director of public prosecution, standing up and saying, I'm going to bring forth a bill to legalize drugs in the whole country? There's then going to be a general election, and his party going to be booted out. So it's
Mm.
not a political hot potato; it's a political meteor. So it's a real hard one. But on a couple of occasions, I've been asked, and this is interesting, by former police officers, judges, and some probation officers to join a pressure group to try and put pressure on the government to at least start looking into alternative ideas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we know one thing, don't we? We can see
But
even
you're
from inference alone that we're never going to solve the so-called drug problem as it is, because, as you say, there'll always be people waiting in the wings to take it up as soon as someone's convicted for drug crime and for gang-related drug crime. It's not going to go away with things as they are, is it?
no. And what if I had the inclination, it'd be interesting to look at the third of all homicides in this country that aren't domestic abuse, and then start looking at how looking at the trail, if you like, from the time that someone's stabbed or the trigger's pulled, uh, what the association is, and you could almost band it into very high drug involvement, amber or green, looking at different scales, which would give you some form of idea of what's causing the problems. And certainly, there was a really good report done from the London Borough of Waltham Forest into gangs and drugs. And when you and it upsets me deeply when I see a young person stabbed to death by another
Yeah.
young person, because it's an absolute lose-lose situation. But a lot of that is manifested around remuneration. So the reason why people join gangs is not to do with respect or culture or anything. It's to do with remuneration and everything that goes with sort of drug trafficking. So if the criminality bit was extracted from that, I think you'd still have to have legislation around, um, people dealing in large amounts. I think you'd still need to have that
Yeah.
in some form of shape or form. But it is a real hot potato, but it's something that we do need to revisit because the current drugs legislation is based on what was in 1971 piece of emergency legislation. Depends, doesn't it, what the country wants, you know, that's or what Parliament perceives the country want.
Yeah, well, this is part of the politicization problem, isn't it? It's, the if if the if the perceived criminality reflect the political agenda of MPs and the civil service and people in party politics. Like, for example, we all know about the what's been called the woke agenda and the offense culture and the censorship of free speech and all of this stuff that's assaulted the society in the last few years. And of course, I guess the police, as well as all the other constraints, they're now having to deal with things that weren't crimes before, like hate crime and online policing and all this sort of thing. And that must just add extra weight to the already broad shoulders they're expected to be carrying at the moment.
It goes further than that, doesn't it? Because there is this non-reportable hate crime,
Yeah. Yeah.
non-reportable hate crime that the police are investigating now. So there is no law or legislation that marshals that behaviour, but they're dealing with that. And I saw satirically that mentioned, I think it was in Private Eye, called the Hurty Word Squad, the Hurty Word Squad, you know. So you've then got police officers dealing with something that's not even an offence of the realm, you know. Very, very, very odd.
Yeah. And from our experience of other things, the more politicized something becomes, and the more the government and the state gets involved with it, the more they're likely to continue to get involved further. So, how do we, what chance do we have of reversing some of this politicization you talked about at the beginning? And how do we reform the police when it's so politicized that the people who are maximally incentivized to keep their foot in the door are unlikely to relent without very much pressure? How do we reverse some of the damage that's been done to the police?
Well, here we are, and I have to say that I'm very proudly a retired officer of the Metropolitan Police, drawing a chief inspector's pension. And what I'm about to say will probably have that rescinded. But one of the things that I believe is worthwhile considering, it's been considered in the States. Why does the chief constable, who is under almost political leadership from a police and crime commissioner, why does that chief constable have to be a police officer? So let me expand on that. First of all, the police and crime commissioner, that should be abolished straight away because it interferes with the operational decision making of a chief constable and always will do. So that needs to go. There still needs to be a police authority, apolitical, that checks the police agenda and their behaviour. You need to do that because if you don't, you then get something horrible that I suppose you could call a police state. I personally, and you hear me clearly here, I've got nothing wrong and nothing against any senior police officer. I was one myself. I personally would get rid of senior management teams that where His Majesty's Inspector Constabulary has adjudged that force to be failing and it continues to fail. Because if I'm in a job in a public sector or private sector and I'm not performing, I'm going to be shown the door.
Yeah.
Well, there is machinery to do that. The Police and Crime Commissioner can out the incumbent chief constable. I personally would get rid of police senior management teams and replace them with non-police officers. That would be my first step, or at least have some independence on there. With certain, again, entrepreneurial. One of the things I found is I did some consultancy for what was then Her Majesty's Chief Inspector Constabulary. And what I found, this is a stupid example, but I found that in Norfolk, Suffolk, and Cambridge, for a police car, a fast car, the difference between one force and another was £15,500 per car for the
Wow.
same car.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Gosh.
So I suggested to the police authorities they do a thing called brigading, where that is basically simply, pooling your money and put a bit of a pressure on the suppliers. So that I don't know how much entrepreneurialism there is in senior management teams. I certainly enjoyed trying to do that. But so that is a very radical step. But again, I also believe, and I don't like this, they're expensive. I also believe there should be a royal commission into policing. The last time that was done in the United Kingdom was 1964. They're expensive, but at the end of the day, from the polls that I see, have the population of England and Wales, Scotland's different, of course, so is Ireland, their policing arrangements, but are people happy with their policing arrangements? Well, I think we know the answer to that. So something has to fundamentally change.
Hmm.
And I think there needs, one of the things I thought was excellent at the time, 1981 Brixton riots, Scarman report, outstanding. Did I like it as a serving police officer at the time? No, I didn't. But it stood the test of time, and it reversed, or certainly started attacking the so-called institutional racism within police services. So a big mountain to climb, I suppose, in a sense. But there needs to be some radical change. Otherwise, we will bumble on with people being very unhappy with the police service.
So,
Uh,
the,
you know,
well, let me ask you this, because if you look at a typical free market model for society, you
yeah,
know that if a company or a provider isn't performing in the market, then they're going to be
yeah,
penalized. A bad restaurant in a
yes,
high street full of good restaurants is going to be penalized by the consumer, and they'll probably eventually go bust. Now,
yeah,
when I talked to the economist David Friedman on my show, who's probably the world's leading economist, I would say, and he's written a book called Machinery of Freedom, and he's of course Milton Friedman's son, and he's a big believer in privatization, and he takes it quite a bit further than perhaps I would, but he believes that pretty much every service should be privatized and that the market merits of because one of the things we do know in the UK and in a lot of countries in Europe too, I'm sure, is that where the state is heavily involved in the provision of the service, they are consistently underperforming. Now, there are a lot of complex reasons why that's true, but the health service, the education, social services, the police, the more the state tries to control and manage something, the harder it is to get it right when you have things like diseconomies of scale. So David Friedman is a big believer that with the kind of selection pressure on the market management, and you mentioned entrepreneurial as well, you know, tapping into what works in the market to give the consumer satisfaction. Now, the consumer, of course, in the police happens to be the people who want to be kept safe and have their property rights preserved and things like that. So, can you can you envisage a kind of a more market friendly, even possibly a private police force being potentially successful? And also, has that ever been tried anywhere in the world that you know of? And it's what are the results if it has?
yeah. I'm delighted you asked that question, because it's already in place in the United Kingdom. It's in place in London. One of
Okay.
my colleagues, same rank, DCI, retired from the Metropolitan Police. He won't mind me saying this. His name is David McKelvey. He has a company called My Local Bobby, and he
Wow.
started off by almost like police wardens. They're given a uniform, but the local population will buy in the services of a uniformed person with the same powers of arrest than us, but his staff have gone up to around about 1,000.
Wow.
So
Fascinating.
that's not far away from looking at the overall personnel. So now what he's doing as well is he's employing solicitors from the fees that he collects and barristers, and they are carrying out private prosecutions. So if you look at a crime which must be horrendous for retailers is shoplifting. When I was a PC
Mm,
years and years ago, as soon as the shoplifting came out, we'd respond to it because we had the resources, we
yeah.
did have the
Yeah.
resources. And the other thing we discussed is the increase in the population in the UK. Anyway, that's another
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
So what McKelvey and his colleagues are doing, they're actually taking people to court. Their power of arrest, they can only arrest someone in the act of committing an offence, whereas a constable, if they've got reasonable grounds to suspect, they can arrest someone. So, but that is really working. But of course, you then need to look at the demographic of where he's operating, and he's
Yeah.
operating in fairly affluent areas where
Mm.
people can afford it. But that's actually changing because some people are thinking, I'd much rather have this high visibility model than
Yeah.
nothing at all. And that's what it that is really what I believe, and I believed this certainly in my last command in Hounslow, together with the mayor of Hounslow, we looked at what is it, very simply, that the population wanted from the
Yeah.
police. And it
Yeah.
was so
And
they investigation of crime, it's not a high priority. They wanted to be safe. They wanted antisocial person, antisocial behaviour stopped,
yeah.
rubbish and graffiti.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
also, I suppose if these de facto private companies start to proliferate and they start to form some sort of successful bond and with the consumer, they start to become more successful around the country in their pockets, then it might increase the appetite for the voter to look at a different model and put more pressure on the state in the way that it has in lots of other sectors. I mean, when you and I had our last drink, you mentioned quite rightly, I think, that on the other side of the coin, there are lots of boroughs and estates, particularly in inner cities and major cities, where and we've all seen this in dramatizations. We've seen news reports and stuff, even if we don't live in them ourselves. But places where it's so insidious, where the criminality and socioeconomic deprivation is so entrenched in the way of living there that the police, I guess, almost treat that as a fairly futile place to try to police. I mean, that's we talked about that last time, didn't we? I guess that's not just still the case, but probably as bad as ever, is it these days?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is a huge link, isn't there, to poverty and less affluent people and crime. You know, that
Mm,
doesn't mean to say a particular class of society commits more crime, but where you've got high unemployment, and I noticed that unemployment's creeping up again, and you've got grinding poverty, then people are going to commit crime,
yeah.
and they will go and join gangs, commit crime. So I must admit, going back, let's look at my own experience. I particularly, and I wasn't a uniform officer for very long, to be honest, but I particularly liked being high visibility in poor socioeconomic areas because
Mm,
that's what they needed.
yeah.
And in fact, most of my career, I went to places where there were these areas, and the police did try at one stage, but it was too expensive to try and get officers to reside in the area that they policed. Well, that didn't work. I started off at Chelsea Police Station, and I lived fairly close by, but no one could afford for me, even years and years ago. But th the other thing, of course, is that again, people of all classes take drugs, cocaine, maybe recreationally, but then on the poorer parts of the metropolis and different parts of the country, drug addiction is a lot higher, and
Mm,
therefore drug dealing again is a lot higher. And of course, that then perpetuates if people don't pay for it, or they steal it, rob it, or whatever the expression is. That again perpetuates more violence.
mm,
A deep-seated problem. Yeah, a deep-seated problem. Then attached to that are the peripheral issues of unemployment, people that are homeless, which again, on that level, it seems to me that there's no political party that's ever really got a proper grip of that. You know, the two
No,
major parties. So, but again, that is a problem. It is a peripheral problem, but homelessness, people being out on the street, and of course they're open to being victimised as well, and
yeah, and
being victims
I
of
guess
crime.
if you look at the numbers as well that we're talking about, if you look at all the different people in the inner city estates and stuff, and if you if you really were to lock away people who are all the people that were caught, dealing drugs, vandalism, burglary, knife crime, violent crime, all of the things that we associate with that, even if you take the drug part out of it and made that legal, you'd then be talking 150, 160, 70,000 people in prison, wouldn't you, at least? And it's just,
Yeah,
yeah, that it's possibly a sort of sticking plaster over the problems because, as you say, you want to get to the root of that, and these are a lot of complex problems, and it's not easy to do that. As you say, education's a factor, unemployment. If you don't have if you don't have proper role models, if you don't have a family unit, if you don't have proper education and encouragement, then for a lot of people, that kind of gang culture, that kind of lifestyle is perhaps for many all they can see for themselves in the immediate future becoming, which I guess is also interesting because I think, I mean, you'll know far better than I will, but crime sort of tails off after 25, doesn't it? I think so. The majority of crime is
yes, it
committed.
does.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
it does.
yeah.
I, the other thing I noticed, and this was one of the core things that I did in the prison, was to make sure you would assess prisoners as they were coming in for a
Mm.
sentence to look at their literacy and numeracy skills. And 9 times out of 10, this was people, well, they had to be over the age of 21, had
Mm.
very, very basic numeracy and literacy. So you've got to wonder, the next question is why are they in that state? So one of the first things I did was really like a bit of emergency numeracy and literary classes to try and get them up to a level and the certificates from city and guilds. So at least they can then start building up certainly a bit of confidence and a bit of self pride or self pride in
Mm. Yeah.
themselves. So then and you hit the nail on the head there. You've then got to ask a question, and I did that. I did some study. One time I was in vulnerable persons unit in Norwich jail,
Mm.
and there were 30 people in that vulnerable persons. And I had the opportunity to speak to most of them because they were locked up. I then had to be inclusive, to look at what sort of education we could offer to these guys that were being locked up for 22 hours a day. And I came to the conclusion, and this is not scientific, that the majority of men that I spoke to that were in prison for not sex offences, but through poor parenting.
Mm.
So again, it's not just a single agency approach. It's got to be someone that really sort of thinks, a lot deeper than that. Is the expression polymath? Is that right? Or someone that's got the ability to be able to view a problem from a lot of different sort of facets.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Polymath would be someone who's informed in a number of areas. Yeah, absolutely. And
yeah, yeah.
let you mentioned at the start something which is hot on many people's top agendas in the news, which is the two-tier policing.
Oh, yeah,
I wanted to ask you about that if we've got time, because one of the most infamous things that's happened in policing in the UK in the last decade or so has been the awful situation with the grooming gangs.
yes.
And what seems to have emerged, and again, I'm cautious because I think with news and media, sometimes it can be difficult to demarcate between or distinguish between what's politically motivated and what's actual journalism. But from my understanding, what emerged from those reports is that this was potentially a systematic attempt by the police to allow things to slip under the radar in order to not appear to be perhaps Islamophobic or racist, because we do know the profile of these grooming gangs were largely Muslim men. And I'm sure there are other things you could comment on in terms of different uh, to do with skin color and perceived racism too. So, has the politicization, in your opinion, of the police, has that had that effect whereby there has been an inability of the police to do their job properly, like in the grooming gangs, because of pressure to not be perceived as racist or Islamophobic, etc.?
Yeah, yeah, very, very much so. So let's look at what that means, two-tier policing. That means policing in two different ways and biasing what should be fair to one particular group. So
Hmm.
in the
Yeah.
newspapers today, an assistant chief constable has come out in the Telegraph, actually, not the Times, and said that in terms of horse, what's it called, fox hunting, that
Hmm.
he would always, always be on the side of the people that are against it, and
Right.
therefore not applying the law properly. Because if then someone damages a horse or the horse, I don't know, is damaged in some ways, then they've got to apply the law. So the previous defence secretary from the previous government has said that he should resign for that. So there is of course that problem because up until very recently, the police service has been accused of being institutionally racist. Now I've tried to academically define that. That can't mean that every single person in the police force is institutionally racist because that's simply
Hmm.
not the case. What it
Hmm.
means is the inability of the senior leaders to prevent it. And that's what, to me, it's all about. So you have to be. It starts off with a constable. I used to say to my personnel, if you stop someone in the street, that could be your mother or father, your brother or sister. And that was really enough to make sure that stops in the street were very even-handed.
Hmm.
That no longer holds true because if I was first of all, there is absolutely, and I loved being a police officer, I simply would not do it because I wouldn't stop anyone. And that sometimes can be a good deterrent if applied properly. And I certainly wouldn't arrest anyone. So what's the point? And the reason being is that I see case after case, and there was this thing recently with these two Olympic athletes allegedly smoking some weed or something, and the police officers were two of them were vilified and sacked. They then went to the
Hmm.
Home Office and appealed, and the Home Office said, "Aha, touch of two-tier policing going on here." They had every right to stop them. So there is an innate fit. And again, I started off by saying the big problem is the politicization of the police service. There is a politician setting out the agenda and having the whip hand to sack a chief constable. That's a politician. So inevitably, their politics are going to permeate into the police force from the top. So if I'm a chief constable, I then may turn a blind eye to, or if I start monitoring males, females, disability, race in terms of stop and search, and I see that there are more black people, I'm going to say to my force, possibly stop stopping so many black people.
Mm.
That is inevitable. So therefore, if a constable then does stop someone and there has been an overemphasis on people being stopped and certainly nothing found, then that's going to put a constable off from doing their job. At the same time, having said all of that, they do need, occasionally you see bad behaviour, but I suppose there would be a fantastic book, wouldn't there? A police constable trying to do the job with handcuffs. And it all boils down to what is it that the public want from the police? Because they can't have it all. They
No,
can't have it all.
and
The,
I,
and
I yeah, and I guess as well with some of the things we're seeing, like the inconsistencies in people who might be out on the street protesting. I think there's been a higher incidence of police action with, say, um, the the right wing as opposed to the left. And I mean, we both know just how aggressive the left can be when they feel like they're not getting. We know. Douglas Murray made a really good point, which he talked about the left and right political spectrum, and he said, if you imagine a sort of arguably a kind of mythological center ground, he said you have to go a lot further to the left before you reach the Gulag than you do the right to reach the Nazi concentration camp. In other words, as soon as people start to show a little bit of right wing, maybe nationalism or ethnocentrism and things like that, it doesn't take long before being perceived as right wing, and possibly, and with some of the links that have been they've been guilty of in the past. Whereas the left, it's perceived, can get away with a lot more because the left, the journey to extreme leftism is a lot longer. And I guess the fact that we're still
yeah,
having the
yes,
conversation about two-tier policing so prominently now, even after things like the grooming scandals and maybe some empirical evidence about, say, I don't know, the ways that the police might react differently to Islam as opposed to some other kind of group of people, either religious or ethnic. I guess we're forced to conclude that it's still a massive problem that's not going to go away soon, aren't we?
yeah, very much so. And if you look at the politics in this country, depending on how you see it or you view it, maybe the previous government were more to the right than central, and you've got this current government with such a big majority, is in essence they can do certainly for 3 years. Let's say they can do what they like in terms of getting legislation through.
Hmm.
Uh, and also, they're not the politicians. They're not going to let anyone stand in their way, and certainly not a chief constable. And my big fear is that it will even be more. The agenda will be even more dictatorial about what a chief constable and therefore all their resources should or shouldn't do.
Hmm.
Yeah, very quite concerning. So I think the first thing that would make a huge difference is release the bonds of politics in policing. It's never ever worked, but at the same time, make sure that the police are accountable. And there's a
Hmm.
number of ways of doing that. We've got, and I think we're lucky to have a completely independent His Majesty's Chief Inspector Constabulary. There's no ex-police officers. They're totally independent, which is
Hmm.
a good thing because the public don't like it. They think it's too heavily biased. So that's good. And at least we're checking. We have checks. So try not to paint too bleak a picture, at least we have in Britain some of these checks and balances, you know,
Mm,
and you know the same goes for the prison service to make sure people are actually being incarcerated in decent conditions.
mm. Yeah, I mean, Steve, I've got one more question if I can before we finish. But I just wanted to say it's been so good to hear your perspective because I know the questions I'm asking, so many people in the country are asking them and feeling the same. And I hope that people will really enjoy listening to your perspective because it's been so useful and so informative. And these are the questions I've had for a long time. So I'm really grateful for you coming on and really enlightening us about your perspective and how we can best answer these questions that are burning to us. So thank you for that. I want to just ask one more question before we close,
Please do.
which you touched on earlier, which is the other side of your expertise, the psychology and the profiling. So you mentioned before we started recording about offender profiling and artificial intelligence and the
Yeah,
sort of things that are being developed now for future gain and
yeah.
for future efficiency. So tell us a bit about that then. What can we be hopeful about with that sort of technology and where might that lead us for better in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly an exciting time for me at the moment. I'm sort of well retired from the police service, but I have the luxury of a lot of criminal psychology is now coming onto the A level curriculum.
Hmm,
And there was this erroneous belief that a lot of very, very good psychology teachers could teach a lot of that. So I'm instructed to go into quite a few sick forms and indeed a couple of universities
brilliant.
in London. So I was at a very exciting time. So I went to university at a time where offender profiling was being brought in from the United States. It was first ramped up or first practiced by the FBI, a guy called Rob Riesler in the 50s. So the
Hmm,
whole idea with offender profiling is rather than looking at the physical evidence at a crime scene, such as the forensic evidence, the CCTV, witness statements, eyewitnesses, and all that, you look at the psychological markers left by a criminal.
hmm,
So the things that you would want to do, and there's two different approaches. There's the European approach and there's the FBI approach. Both have got their own merit. But what is interesting is looking at, so historically, if I'm investigating a series of, let's just say, series of serious sexual offences, which I did in Battersea,
hmm,
from the skills that I'd accrued practically and academically, I was able to work out that this attacker, you get two types, are either a commuter, so they operate away from the area in which they live, work, or socialize, or they're a marauder and they operate locally to where
hmm,
they've got anchor points, so where they drink, where they go, where they live, where they work. So that is very, very exciting. So it's using past data to try and inform the police of the character, the likelihood. But the one step further is the geographical profile in trying to work out where that person resides, works, or socializes. So that is all very, very interesting. But
hmm,
what is even more interesting is then applying artificial intelligence to that. So what is useful is if you're now looking for a particular criminal and for either a linked series of crimes, no matter what that might be. But of course, it's better to apply offender profile into murder, homicide, and serious sexual offences because those are, that's where the priorities should lie.
hmm,
So with artificial intelligence, what I've been looking for is I've looked at some of it, but it's trying to find an expert that can teach me how it can be used, and it's phenomenal. So the first thing is that in a cold case, so one that has been put on ice, if you like, there is the facility now to take a 30 centimeter bundle of papers and get it scanned and then start looking
Hmm.
through the net for commonality.
Yeah.
Exciting now is, let's just say that as a an offender profiler, I've put out a profile for someone and they're arrested. Then, with things like their mobile phones, search, where they've been, their relationships, and everything, all of that data can then be fed into the literature, which makes it even more exciting. And of course, sort of traditional methods of policing, go back to the 60s and 70s where we had all these different Dixon of Dock Green, which was your traditional policing model, this flying squad. All the time, police science has to evolve. It has to.
Hmm.
So therefore, offender profile is a real good one, and it goes further than murder cases or serious sexual offences. In testament to the great education I had from the Met, which I think was world class at the time, and some of it still is, and my university, every month, and this is what your readers can come onto, is I do a free criminal and forensic psychology online gig every month. So you can access it through Facebook, and it's called Criminal and Forensic Psychology Addicts.
Hmm.
And what I've
Okay.
done is I've already set my stall out with 12 Zoom links, and one of them, unsurprisingly, I'm going to expand and unpack what offender profiling is, where it's been used, where it's been successful, and also the superimposing of AI. It's so exciting, to the point that I wouldn't mind going back to the police service to sort of try it out. But that's police science is really quite interesting. It's just trying to bring on, DNA, of course, is interesting.
Hmm.
That's all interesting, but you've always got to be looking at other ways of getting ahead of criminals, either organised or highly intelligent criminals. Uh,
Yeah,
so
I suppose
that
that,
is my sort of.
yeah. Sorry, I was just thinking as well. Yeah, I guess there might maybe future technology could also help us solve the prison crisis in maybe in terms of, I don't know, having more sophisticated tagging than we've got now, and that keeping people, you know, is that a possibility too, do you think? Could we develop that more sophisticated way, do you think?
Well, definitely, because we got to do something, and it goes back to the argument that we had about
Yeah.
prison places in the UK. We've got to do something. Yeah, we've got to do something, and it could be through AI and maybe through psychometrics that you could actually harness the intelligence or where the prisoners' skills really are, maybe non-academic skills, to try and get them on a different pathway.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. Steve, thank you so much. It's been so interesting, and I'm gonna get some one or two links from you in a second. I'll put them in the description below so people can look at your work and join one of your seminars and explore that further. So I just
No.
really appreciate you being a guest on the show, and I've learned a lot, and I hope the viewers do too. So Steve Gaskin, thank you so much for joining us, and for everyone else, thank you for tuning in. And lovely to speak with you, Steve, as always.
Okay, thanks, James.
Thanks, Steve. Goodbye, everyone. Bye, Steve.